Hello everyone and welcome to Filtered. My name is Phil Dye. I'd like to especially welcome those listeners who have transferred from the Marking the Role Substack platform over to Filtered. If you're new to Filtered, I'll be covering the social issues that affect education, their parenthood, families, and younger people growing up in Australia. We hear so much about the business issues, the economy, all of that stuff, but we don't hear much about the social issues that affect us. I've long upheld that the world is more than just a shop, and I'll be using that as the underlying philosophy behind this podcast. I'd also like to add that this will not be in video format. I know a lot of podcasts are, but this will not be in video format. It's only audio, and I'll be limiting each episode to less than 40 minutes because I think that 40 minutes is around about it that we can listen to without having a longer break. I will be inserting brain breaks in the form of songs. There's one song in this episode which I think you'll find pretty damn interesting. Anyway, today I'll be interviewing Clare Rowe. Clare Rowe is a child psychologist from Sydney, an outspoken psychologist, someone who really tells it like it is. This episode we'll be looking at issues relevant more to younger children, maybe 4 years old to 12, 13 years old, and the next episode we'll be looking more at the teenage years. Childhood has changed dramatically in the last 20 years. Girls walking down the street of 9 or 10 years old and they look 14 or 15. Children 5 years old are wearing t-shirts of a political nature about Trump or climate change. Boys can often seem lost and not know what's expected of them. And young men certainly seem too scared to speak out about matters that impact them. In educational matters, boys have been left behind in favour of the phrase that girls can do everything, and boys wonder what can they do that's equal but different. Things that would never have happened 20 years ago, but it's a different world that we live in. Children have trouble navigating it. Childhood anxiety is really on the rise in Australia. It's on the rise everywhere, I think. And child psychologist Clare Rowe spends a lot of her time with kids who are overly anxious and examining the reasons for this childhood anxiety. Welcome to Filtered, Clare.
Thank you very much, Phil. Great to chat.
Clare, could you just take us through your qualifications, your history, why you became interested in all of this in the first place?
Yeah, sure. So my master's degree is in educational and developmental psychology. It's a bit of a dying master's degree now, actually. It was a very good one. I never thought I'd work with children, funnily enough. I always thought I'd go into adults and possibly some drug and alcohol work. But in the end, in a placement, I had to go out to a school and worked with kids, and then I never looked back. And here I am 20 years later, and I've, built a career working solely just with children and families. I've been working in private practice in Sydney now for the last 15 years, and I've assembled a like-minded team around me there. And, we see families in our clinic every week. I also appear as a single expert witness for the Family Court and Federal Circuit Court of Australia. So looking at working with high conflict families and allegations of risk and abuse in that setting and helping children navigate that pretty lengthy and terrible system.
The listeners to this episode will more likely be parents and teachers, really, wanting to know what's going on with kids. What are the figures about the increase or decrease in childhood and adolescent anxiety over the past 20 or 30 years? Have you seen figures on that?
Yeah, look, the numbers are undeniable. We're looking at, of course, diagnosed cases here. In Australia, rates of childhood anxiety have skyrocketed, even in the last, I would say, Phil, 5 to 7 years. I think 20 years ago, you may have seen anxiety at around the 5 to 7% of children. Now we're looking at 1 in 4 children or adolescents experiencing a mental health disorder, with anxiety topping that list. And that's, as I said, just the diagnosed cases.
So, Clare, in a standard Australian classroom, you're going to have a quarter of the kids who are formally diagnosed with a mental health disorder. That seems amazing.
You know, on paper, something's going awfully wrong, and we're seeing a generation of kids who are not just a bit stressed. I think they're overwhelmed, they're dysregulated, and I think entirely ill-equipped to handle the normal ups and downs of life. They're very fragile.
Is this an international trend? Is it happening in other countries?
Yes, I don't think it's just an Australian issue. It is global. You'll see the same trend across the UK and the US, Canada, New Zealand. I will point out that I think it's far more of a Western trend, wherever children are growing up in overly, I think, stressed out, anxious environments where resilience, I think, is replaced with fragility. You'll see the same result. So, yeah, I think it's a byproduct of a cultural shift.
I think there's plenty of teachers listening who have their own theories. I have my own theories. But what do you think has caused this?
Oh, that's the million-dollar question. And, of course, when I say I'm a child psychologist in the street, this is what I get asked. I mean, you know, we know more about childhood development and parenting in the brain than ever before, but our kids are the most, you know, anxious and stressed out and clingy and dysregulated than ever. There's a couple of broad themes here, Phil. I think I'm an advocate for saying that we've really removed this protective scaffolding of childhood. Children, I think, are being exposed to adult issues of significant emotional weight that they are not developmentally capable of processing. So at the moment I'm working on a project looking at the way that climate change is taught to 5 to 7-year-olds in a very alarmist way. Gender ideology, pandemic panic, politics, all presented to them with this sense of kind of urgency and moral obligation. So
history's another one, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. So I think we've pushed kids into this really hyper adult world without obviously their cognitive skills to navigate it. And then we're surprised when they crumble under pressure. So
I think society's been very quick to blame the internet and the media, but we're talking young kids here, so we're really looking at teachers and parents, aren't we?
I'm just a really strong believer that, you know, there needs to be this return to the protection of what is childhood and that division between the child and adult world. And I get very concerned when parents bring their 7-year-old into me and are proud of them being, you know, an anti-Trump eco-warrior. I think they're 7.
Lord.
They shouldn't know any of these concepts yet because the brain has so much to do on a daily basis at 7. And if you're going to fill it with all these other adult concepts and political agendas, it's not going to be able to develop normally. And I see that as a major problem. I describe it as a kind of a pollutant, brain pollutant, and it's pulling them off the normal task of developmental rhythm.
So by adding this adult concepts, is it possible that the child bypass important child development steps in trying to do the adult stuff?
Yes, I think so. I mean, there's only so much bandwidth neurologically in the brain, and I think we forget, you know, childhood is not just about, oh, let them just have fun and let's not worry them and let them do their finger painting. There's a lot going on in that finger painting or the playing or the, you know, there's a lot of neural connections that are being formed that as adults we have already done. And so we forget how busy that brain is day to day. When it looks like they're having fun and playing, that brain's working hard at development and still growing. And so there's only a certain amount of bandwidth. If you're going to fill it with other stuff, they're not going to be able to develop normally. I think that's a massive reason kids are overwhelmed, stressed out and anxious.
What about family breakdown? Are more of these kids, the 25%, come from broken families, or is there no research on that?
I think there's the decline of a traditional family unit and role of parenting. More than ever, lots of children growing up in the crossfire of parental conflict or no stable base or attachment.
What about the lack of boundaries, Claire? You mentioned the protective scaffolding that used to exist around children. Does part of that scaffolding include boundaries?
Oh, 100%. I think parents are terrified of upsetting their kids or being too harsh or traumatizing. But I say, boundaries and discipline are not trauma. They're the bedrock of emotional safety. And kids need adults in charge. And so in some sense, I don't blame parents. I think parents also, this is this perfect storm that's happened in one generation, and parents are exposed to so much information about parenting that has actually led us astray. So there's the blogs and the Facebook groups and the podcasts and the books and in previous generations, our mothers may have asked their mothers what they did, and that's pretty much it. They were far more in a sense connected with their parenting instinct of mammals that have been doing this for millions of years. Really what we're seeing with the generation of anxious kids is parents who are paralyzed with not knowing what to do because they've read a book that says, that your kid might feel kind of abandoned if you send them to their room or nonsense like that.
Or you can't say no to the child.
You can't say no. And you must validate their emotions continually all the time and all this nonsense. And so parents come in and, of course, then they're given stats about kind of the mental health crisis and suicide rates and all this stuff. And they come in terrified, parents to me, of not doing the wrong thing.
And of being seen in the supermarket, Claire, of being overly disciplinary of their child and someone taking a video.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. And so they're just in a state of paralysis now that they really don't know what to do. And the inability to say no has led to a generation who feel anxious because they are actually, 5, 8, 9-year-olds are in charge at home. And that's terrifying for a child. A child may say they want control, but if they're given control, they don't know what to do with it. And so you get these kids who are really dysregulated and out of control because they are so stressed and anxious because they're in charge.
It's very interesting that you say that because, you said that they're becoming adults and they're being put in charge, but there is a increase in children going to kindergarten in nappies. It's as if their head is being filled with all of these concepts about nuclear energy and climate, but they're forgetting to be toilet trained.
Yeah, and it's weird, isn't it? At the same time, they're quite infantilized. And they can be put in charge in one sense, but actually, in another sense, they're really stunted kids these days in their independence. At the same time, which sounds contradictory to what I just said, but I have primary school kids myself, and I'm sure some people would be horrified to know that in the last school holidays, I sent them on a very safe small walk around the block to Coles to get some milk and bread, and they were, I think, 6 and 7 years old at the time.
Crikey, you'll be hung for that, Claire.
And so that stuff was done regularly a generation ago. Kids were allowed more freedom in that sense to go and explore their world and make mistakes and get injured and work out what they can and can't do.
Yes.
And yet we seem to have flipped this, on one hand, great overprotection of kids. And parents will come in to me and complain that their 15-year-old can't make a peanut butter sandwich, but you've never allowed them to. You won't wake up when they're 15 and have an independent child. It starts in preschool years. Get them to do things then.
I guess like making their own bed or maybe even making their own play lunch.
Yes. And yet at the same time, they're given a lot of control and say and choice, making them quite demanding and, as I said, I think anxious.
Yeah, they're helicoptered.
I think we do have another thing I'm quite passionate about. I do think we have this therapeutic culture where we do pathologise every difficult feeling.
Yeah.
Now, there's a whole reasons for that, including funding and other things, but behaviours are quick to be labelled disorders, and every setback is met with a therapist. And it often sounds a bit strange coming from a child psychologist that I think a lot of children should not be handed over to this so-called expert. I mean, the expert should be mum and dad, and that a lot of children, certainly in in the middle of Sydney or first world countries, shouldn't be in therapy. I mean, what a sad state of affairs that we've got so many of child psychologists seeing seeing children. And I think a lot of well-meaning therapists actually reinforce this fragility. These children come in and they, on their fortnightly sessions, and they're validated that all their emotions are valid and correct. And, so I think therapists have a lot to answer for, actually, in my profession of maintaining these victims.
Yes, I read a book about 35 years ago by James Hillman called "We've Had 100 Years of Psychotherapy and the World's Getting Worse." And that was a tremendous read.
Yes. And, of course, there's that wonderful book by Abigail Schreier recently, Bad Therapy, that I would highly recommend to people. I read that book and was very frustrated because it was the book I should have written. It's a wonderful book and really does explain what's going on. And that's before, Phil, we've even spoken about their digital environment, which I suppose we could have a whole day talking about.
That's a whole other topic.
But, the screens dominate childhood now, and the opportunities for face-to-face play and movement and risk-taking and unstructured time has been dramatically reduced.
You mentioned risk-taking there. I mean, around about 30 years ago, I wrote a book called The Father Load, which looked at the trend of dads actually becoming male mothers and not taking the risks that my dad might have taken or his dad might have taken with him, and just simply copying what the mum did. And that kids nowadays don't take the risks of climbing mountains, of learning to ride a bike early. How much do you think this trend of kids, being anxious and not resilient comes from not having the father around and therefore not being exposed to risks?
I think it's a very valid point. I think we need to have the confidence to be able to matter-of-fact say fathers bring something different to the table that mothers simply don't.
Equal but different.
Yeah, especially around that risk-taking and independence, and emotional detachment in the right sense of the word, of that learning to be independent from mum and dad. So when our fathers are either absent, or these days they may not be absent, but they're, as you said, overly passive or almost emasculated, children miss out on that edge of challenge and resilience building, and in particular boys, because they're either kind of emotionally stunted or they've got no clear model of healthy masculinity. But what I would say to that is, and I suppose this is a call out to mums out there, again, you need to let fathers take that role, and you need to let them do things and, rough and tumble play or spend some time with the children without you present. And sometimes
Yes, that's what I said 30 years ago, that sometimes it's just dressing the child the way you want to dress the child, ready for the activities that you're doing during the day. Alan and Unwin published my book, and I think they regretted it because, geez, it came in for some flack. But yes, dads taking the lead when you've got the child on your own.
Yeah, sometimes I hear mothers kind of whinge when the child's a bit older, later primary school years, of saying, oh gosh, he's so hopeless and you can't do much with him. But you've kind of shut him out a bit and taken the reins too much all the time. Yeah, you need to allow fathers from day one to be in their fathering, which may look very different to your mothering, but that's good. That's okay. It doesn't have to be done the same way as you're doing it.
I wonder what it was like in 1960, way back in your time. Guys were flooding without messaging. I wonder if I asked Grandpa, what was your generation like? Did you send all the girls Snapchats and make all the girls cry? I ain't asking Dad, 'cause he's a Gen X and I'm just a millennial, and everything's about sex. Guys don't ask me to dance, Grandma, they're just just pushing buttons on their Apples and Samsungs. And that's the difference with you and me. You grew up without technology, and guys, don't ask me to dance, Grandma. I wonder, what was it like to have boys knock at your door? Did they drop off you flowers and leave letters on your porch? 'Cause some girls get these Snapchats and they just want to get in my drawers. Guys, don't ask me to dance, Grandma. They're just pushing buttons on their Apples and Samsungs. And that's the difference with you and me. You grew up without technology. And guys, don't ask me to dance, Grandma.
Isn't that song a beauty? That was Danielle France from Shell Harbour in New South Wales. We're going to be revisiting that song in the next episode, in part 2, about guys just, texting and everything's on the phone, and has technology completely ruined things. Guys, don't ask me to dance, Grandma. That was a brain break, actually, and a brain break gives us a little chance to have a rest and come back to the rest of the interview with Clare Rowe. Look, getting on to a touchy subject, and that is ADD and ADHD with children. Now, I'm gathering that the 25% of kids under the age of 18 would fall into that, or a lot of them would fall into the ADD and ADHD category. Has this been overdiagnosed?
ADHD, I'll start by saying we understand there's a very real condition of the frontal lobes of the brain, and either the ineffectiveness or unavailability of certain neurotransmitters. I think it is grossly overdiagnosed now. We think that true neurological ADHD affects about 3 to 5% of children. But I think, we're handing out labels all over the place now, and it's often used to explain away behaviour that is environmental, whether that be excess screens, lack of sleep. Lack of sleep is just huge with children. I mean, I don't think parents really these days have a grasp on what good sleep is or how much kids need. And, of course, then they're irritable and hyperactive and inattentive during the day. Lack of routines, inconsistent parenting. So,
yes.
So I do think one of the issues with this, Phil, is that people are often surprised to hear there is no test for ADHD. So whilst we know that it's a lack of certain neurotransmitters in the prefrontal cortex of the brain, we don't have a test, as in a brain scan, a blood test, an X-ray. We don't have a medical definitive test to say, look, here are your results compared to someone else's. Yes, you have ADHD. No, you don't. And so what it is a clinical opinion. And so in the way that psychology and psychiatry has moved in recent years, we've moved from looking at the causes of behaviour, of why someone is presenting, that they can't focus, to simply ticking check boxes. And if you fulfill a certain amount of these, tick a certain amount of boxes, then technically you qualify for an ADHD diagnosis. So I'm a little bit down again on my profession of, okay, well, you could tick the boxes of, inattentiveness and impulsivity and hyperactivity. Yes, yes, yes. But one of the real hallmarks of the psychology profession should be differential diagnosis. And I feel like that's what we're losing, or we've lost.
Hold on, by differential diagnosis, do you mean examining the why?
Yes, exactly. So what we should be doing, and if any of parents out there are taking their child to a psychologist or a pediatrician, is okay, we've ticked the boxes. We know that you are displaying all the symptoms of ADHD. Now, we don't have a definitive test, in fact, to know if it's ADHD or not. So let's park that to the side right now. And let's ask ourselves, it may be ADHD, but what else could it be? What else could it be? And whatever clinician you go to needs to be doing a thorough interview of asking about your screen time and your sleep and your social relationships and behaviour in different environments with grandparents at school. And I feel like a lot of that complexity and nuance and thorough assessment has been lost.
But Claire, that could be very uncomfortable for parents, because asking those questions then makes the parent examine their own role as parents of what they've let that child do. For example, have screen time till 2 a.m. in the morning.
Oh, absolutely. But the alternative is that we hand out labels like party favours. That's the alternative. And so we need some I think brave clinicians is even overstepping it. It's not even being brave, actually. It's just being, particularly psychology, I think, needs to come back to recognising that we always put ourselves forward as being a scientific, evidence-led profession, right? We're medical practitioners. That's how we have to align ourselves, and that we need to ask those questions, because we are diagnosing people with what might be a lifelong label and puts them onto a path very quickly into medication.
So these kids, a lot of them are being medicalised and labelled, when really it's possibly a problem in the parenting and the rules that are set in the household. Getting back to that issue of kids on their phones or on their devices till the early hours of the morning, this is a great scene in the series Adolescence, which is on Netflix, where the mum and the dad are talking about what they could have done better, and it's a very sad scene. Look, have a listen.
Never left his room. He'd come home, slam the door straight up the stairs on the computer. I'd see the light on at 1 o'clock in the morning. And I'd knock and I'd say, "Jamie, come on, son, you've got school tomorrow." And the lights would turn off, but he never said nothing.
We couldn't do nothing about that. All kids are like that these days, aren't they? You don't know what they're watching in their room, love. Could be watching porn or anything, do you know what I mean? You can't keep an eye on them all the time, love. We just can't.
But there is something that you can do about it. My niece, Ashley, and good on you, Ashley, she's with a 16-year-old boy, takes the phone at 9 o'clock at night and charges it in their bedroom, so he can't get the phone. Now, he fought back about that, initially, but now it's just normal. It's just a normal part of household practice that he doesn't have his phone after 9 o'clock. Now, perhaps, Claire, are there parents that find that it's easier to go to a psychologist and get a diagnosis and get some sort of label attached to their child than it is to be a strong parent and enforce boundaries and say yes and no and say this is the rules in the house, however uncomfortable that might be?
So yes, it is uncomfortable, I understand. And these days, a lot of parents want the label in some ways, and they come and pay for the assessment, and these assessments aren't cheap. Same with the autism assessments. And so I think, unfortunately, you also get, earlier career clinicians who feel quite pressured to label children because these parents have come and paid a lot of money for this assessment, and it's almost as if they are buying the diagnosis, rather than buying your expert opinion and thorough examination of the child, which, of course, what the value should be.
Here's something else very sticky, Claire. How much of it is because the parent can then get some sort of NDIS payment?
Yeah, The NDIS, I mean, ADHD specifically is not funded. I mean, the government's already broke. The government would be even more broke if ADHD was on the NDIS. But under 7 years old, you don't actually need a diagnostic label to get onto the NDIS. You just need to show markers that there are difficulties. So I've seen enough to know that this system is being completely exploited. I mean, as I remind people, the National Disability Insurance Scheme, okay? And so it was never designed to support the worried well or kids with some social difficulties or some behavioural difficulties. It was never meant to be a funding source for parenting issues. But yes, these presentations are now being used as tickets to access support.
Yes.
Even if the root cause is entirely behavioural or circumstantial. Let me be clear again, I don't necessarily blame parents. I think most are just trying to get support for their child in a system that's incredibly confusing. And the real issue here is the dilution of diagnostic standards. So what I mean by that for everyone, we've reached a point where very mild cases of a child having some difficulty at school or home and struggling a little bit, and in need maybe of some short-term intervention, are going on to a disability scheme.
And the child is then labelled for life. They might just be a little bit naughty or not know how to behave properly or not tell the rules, but they're labelled for life.
Yes. This is a scheme that was originally intended for permanent and significant disability, for people that could not contribute to, taxes themselves or work themselves. And of course, those vulnerable people in society we should be looking after. But now we get this case where over half of the NDIS recipients are now for mental health issues. It does raise real society questions of what do we expect as a society that we will fund?
Yeah.
Or what do we expect the government to fund, which is, don't forget us, as I remind people, that's us. The government doesn't create money, it's our money. Are we happy to all pitch in money and support children who are struggling to make some friends at school or are having some struggles at home?
And that was Clare Rowe, child psychologist from Sydney in Australia, talking about whatever happened to childhood in the early years. Clare will be back in the next episode and we'll be looking at teenagers and the social trends that have impacted on their development. If you have any questions or comments about this episode, just email them to phil@filtered.com.au, phil@filtered.com.au, and remember it's filtered with a PH, ILTERED, or make your comments in the comments section of the episode notes. The link to Clare Rowe's website is also in the episode notes. I'd be really grateful that if you found this episode worthwhile, share it with your family and friends. It's free to be a subscriber to Filtered on Substack. So in the next episode, we'll be talking about whatever happened to childhood in the latter years. My name's Phil Dye. Thanks for listening. I'll see you again soon.